It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to yet another Humanitas lecture at our university. These lectures are intended to bring leading scholars from particularly Oxford and Cambridge as visiting lecturers to European universities and to address major themes in the arts and social sciences, but also in the humanities. The program was created by the late Lord Weidenfeld, who passed away in January this month, way in his 90s, who had been a very important politician, publisher, a man who tried to build bridges between various cultures. He was from Austria, he was Jewish, but he always tried to build bridges between Germany and other countries again. So he did, in his long, long lifetime, a lot of very, very important jobs. Now, this program is managed, therefore, and funded by the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust, to which we are deeply grateful for the sponsoring and for organizing part of tonight's lectures. Not everything, we did also a bit. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Passauer Neue Presse in general and to Frau Diekmann, one of the editors of the Passauer Neue Presse in particular. She is currently moving, she's not in Passau, otherwise I'm quite sure she would have been here because she has never missed a lecture like this. A final word of gratitude goes to the University of Passau and to my colleague Bernhard Stahl, indefatigable in organizing major events. We are happy and deeply honored to welcome tonight's lecturer. Professor Sally Shuttleworth teaches at St. Anne's College at the University of Oxford. She studied and she taught at the universities, a long list, of York, Cambridge, Harvard, and Princeton. And after her return from the States, she continued her research work at the University of Leeds, Sheffield, before moving on to the University of Oxford, where she has been teaching for the past 10 years. She is one of the leading, perhaps the leading expert on Victorian literature and Victorian culture. She has published extensively on 19th century writings, and she edited numerous classic Victorian titles like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, Thomas Hardy's Two on a Tower, and many, many more. And in addition to her editorial work, she has become increasingly interested in aspects of psychology and the treatment of mental illnesses during the 19th century. Perhaps two titles that sort of frame her interest in this. An early one is George Eliot and 19th Century Science, The Make-Believe of a Beginning in 1987, probably also marked the beginning of her interest in this particular field. And she continued this interest throughout her career in a more recent publication, The Mind of the Child, Child Development in Literature, Science and Medicine, 1840 to 1900. She's currently involved in several financially and institutionally supported research programs in this particular field, where psychology, science, medicine and literature in the Victorian period meet. The topic of her lecture tonight is, as you can see, diseases of modern life, stress, strain, and overload in the 19th century and perhaps also in the 20th century, we will see. Sally, we are very, very honored and delighted to have you with us, and we're looking terribly forward to your paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be in Passau and also to be giving this lecture, which I'd like to dedicate to Lord Weidenfeld, who I worked with very closely in setting up the Humanitas programme. He was a wonderful colleague to work with. The talk I'm going to give is linked to a research project I'm running at the moment in Oxford, which is funded by the European Research Council on the diseases of modern life. Now, we're constantly told, in an age of information. You can't open a newspaper without seeing headlines about how we're being bombarded too much with information from the media and the internet, and that the stresses of work that are being created by the speeds of global communication. What our project asks is this really so new and different? And can we indeed learn from the past and apply perspective to our current dilemmas? These visions of information overload have their historical counterparts in the industrial age. that in 1860, a young medic, James Crichton Browne, addressed the Royal Medical Society of Edinburgh in terms which strikingly parallel current debates. We live, he proclaimed, and I have a slide for you, in an age of electricity, of railways, of gas, and of velocity in thought and action. In the course of one brief month, more impressions are conveyed to our brains than reach those of our ancestors in the course of years. And our mentalizing machines are called upon for a greater amount of fabric than was required of our grandfathers in the course of a lifetime. So you can recognize the sorts of arguments we have now, this sense of the extraordinary velocity of thought and action which we have to bring to our everyday lives. Then it was the age of railways, of telegraphs, of electricity. Now, of course, it's the internet, but very, very striking parallels, I think. So such perceptions of increased velocity in thought and action and of wear and tear on our brains were part of an emerging diagnosis of the problems of modernity to be found in the interlocking realms of 19th century literature, medicine, science and popular journalism. There's Matthew Arnold, in his poem The Scholar Gypsy of 1885, famously invoked this strange disease of modern life with its sick hurry and heads o'ertaxed. And in novels and periodical articles, one finds numerous and increasingly complex psychological explorations of the phenomenon. Now, we take the project title from a work by someone called Benjamin Ward Richardson, which very few people have heard of nowadays, Diseases of Modern Life of 1876. But works like these then conferred scientific authority on popular perceptions, outlining new and diverse forms of disease produced by the conditions of modernity. Now, given that I had to travel here yesterday with all the attendant stresses and strains, I thought I would give you a passage from Richardson on the dangers of catching a train. So there is more in the act than the mere haste. There is the attendant excitement, the looking out for the signs that the train is still there, the breathless mode of inquiry, how long it will be before the train starts, the hurry to get past people on the platform, the trepidation perchance to get a ticket, the numberless little irritations which come in the way, the pits and pats of temper, if any obstacles give trouble and annoyance, and other anxieties which I need not wait to describe. These all add their quota to the general disturbance and to the strain which cripples or to the strain which kills. Luckily, I'm still here. But, and I should add to that list of all the problems one encounters, touch screens in railway stations when you're trying to get your ticket and miss the train because you cannot work the new technology. But you can see that what they were doing in the 19th century was looking at the impact, not merely on sort of, it's annoying having to rush around for a train, but really registering the way in which it affects both the mind and the body in really strong physiological terms. And from that, they then started looking at the interconnection of the physiological and psychological life of the body. And so very much prefiguring our current understandings. Now, whilst focusing on diseases from worry and mental strain, these works also explored illnesses generated by physical conditions such as poisoned air, as well as what we now call lifestyle diseases, including the abuse of alcohol and narcotics by the middle classes, and disease from late hours and broken sleep, which students clearly know all about. Particular targets of interest were bankers and financiers, politicians and other professional classes who were deemed to be suffering from unprecedented levels of mental stress. And interestingly, these arguments were also extended to the young in international outcries concerning overpressure in education, expressed in a wonderfully titled book published in Britain. It was Dr. Pridgeon Teale, and he called his book Hurry, Worry and Money, the Bane of Modern Education, of 1883, but could we not transfer it to right now? Interestingly, right across Europe in the 1880s, they became very preoccupied with the fear that with the increase of education, all the young were developing new patterns of nervous disorder, often leading them to suicide. Such works form part of a wider interest in the literature, science and medicine of the period, in the ways in which the structures of the 19th century mercantile and industrial economy could be imprinted on the mind and body. And one area I'm particularly interested in is that of the sanitary movement. If you've heard of this, this is very much, it's normally represented as, oh, the Victorians were obsessed by dirt and drains. What I want to suggest that it's far more interesting than that, in that pursuing their ideas of the sanitary life, they were looking at the whole way in which you have to think about the body within a lived environment. The project itself has various strands. One of them is looking at the diseases of the professions, and particularly one on finance and speculation. Now, the Victorian period, just as our own, experienced huge economic turbulence. There was the failure of 29 banks, innumerable crashes on the stock exchange. And so in Victorian fiction, sudden loss of wealth became a standard. And medical writing developed new categories of psychopathology linked to a career in commerce or finance. Thus, in a popular book called Brain Work and Overwork of 1888, part of a series optimistically entitled Long Life, George Black painted in graphic terms the experience of a banker caught, it says, in the hoarse, surging crowd of a Black Friday, and suggesting that it would be months before his nervous system recovered from the strain of that one day. So a sense then that for bankers and for financiers, the emotional investment that you have when you're watching the stock exchange and wondering what on earth is going to happen to your shares, etc., is absolutely reinforcing the pressures and the strains, and so that you then end up either insane or worn down from wear and tear on the brain. I offer you another slide here. This is from the Journal of Mental Science by someone called Frederick McCabe in 1875 on mental strain and overwork. So, it says, speculations of an extensive character, risks out of all proportion to the means at the command of the venturer, undertakings whose successful issue hangs upon the good faith of distant governments of unstable character, overtrading, stock exchange gambling, all these conditions constitute a web of inextricable complexity surrounding the enterprising commercial of the day, man of the day, and rendering his life one of constant excitement. Telegrams arriving at all hours with fluctuating quotations and producing rapid alternations of hope and fear must preclude all possibility of mental repose during the pauses of any legitimate business in which the speculator may be engaged. In men whose nervous systems have been overwrought through the exhaustion brought about by this modern form of lust of wealth, the symptoms of mental strain commonly appear with alarming rapidity. So here you substitute the internet, and again, I think you're virtually within the 21st century. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about what the coming of the telegram did, because we have this sense that we've created this newly global world with the internet. But of course, once they created the telegram, you were in instant access with virtually the entire world. So if you were a banker, you would know within minutes what was happening in the stock exchanges right across your own country and right across the world. So the sense of participating constantly in international world was very much part of 19th century experience. In his essays on diseases of overworked men, Benjamin Ward Richardson talks about the addictive personality that develops in relationship to finance. And he argues, interestingly, that these men develop a craving for more work. Which again I think we can see registered in the way in which people daren't leave their desk these days, constantly at their terminal. But also they then develop fears of lapses of memory and become morbidly sensitive to criticism. But also, interestingly, he suggests that they start to inhabit an imaginative world. He says of the speculator, his life is surrounded by a vulgar romance. His overweening self-confidence and his consciousness that he either can or ought to devise schemes and calculations that must or should carry the day create in him an enthusiasm which could well be devoted to a better cause. So this sense that constantly you have to be thinking of new schemes and that you have a power that will allow you to sail through everything, whatever. But he then suggests that these individuals then start taking to stimulants in order to maintain this overweening self-confidence, leading then to worries, mistakes in calculation, and frequently suicide. You find in the Victorian novel many examples of financiers who then go on to commit suicide. Dickens' Little Dorrit has the figure of Merdle, for example, or Melmoth in Trollope's The Way We Live Now of 1875, and a whole slew of other lesser works, including, for example, Davenport Dunn of 1859. Many of these were linked to the case of an Irish MP and financier, John Sadleir, who was called the Prince of Swindlers, who went and virtually destroyed the economy of Ireland and then committed suicide in 1856. Now, I thought I would think about this theme not in relation to these very evident examples of the financier, but to a novel by George Eliot, written in 1876, called Daniel Deronda, which was her final novel. But I'll come to that in a minute. Just a bit on the diseases of the professions. Because financiers were not the only figures deemed to suffer from nervous overstrain. Thus, it was deemed not necessary to be in contact with a city to suffer from mental overstrain. The Lancet, for example, recorded the sad case of a Cambridge classicist, someone you'd think might be protected from the outer world, who nonetheless died by his own hand, another victim, it says, of the pressures of overwork. And in his book on fatigue, the Italian physiologist Angelo Mosso explored the nervous disorders of his academic colleagues at the University of Turin, including, and this is one of my favourite anecdotes, the case of a professor who was so terrified of lecturing that he had to be carried into the lecture theatre by two of his colleagues, who then stood on either side of him and propped him up right throughout the lecture. And then he was sort of more or less sort of carried off. And so overcome was he by the experience of having to lecture to people. So the sense then that even the academics were victims of these new forms of pressure. Such cases formed part of the new medical registration of abnormal fears and terrors, which became part of the growing complex of phobias and nervous disorders. And I think you're probably familiar with Freud and his concerns with phobias, but the concerns started a lot earlier, in the 1870s, and from that point you find commentators constantly asking, why is it that all our populations seem to be developing these strange, unaccountable fears? Politicians and literary men were thought to be particularly at risk of developing diseases of the profession, whilst interestingly, opinion was rather divided as to whether doctors were very susceptible. Even hard-working clergy were also deemed to be potential sufferers from strain. Thus, in a work entitled On Overwork and Premature Decay, a figure called C.H. Routh reminded people that even our Saviour often journeyed to the seaside or sought refuge in gardens and high hills in order to recuperate his strength. So you've got this wonderful sense then of complete biblical reinterpretation of which it goes to support the notion that transplantation to a healthier clime actually is a religious duty. And although comic in part, I think these examples point to the ways in which the professionalisation of work culture gave rise to its own forms of pathological expression in medical and popular literature. And as I've suggested, these stresses of professional life also linked the emergence of new forms of concerns with patterns of addiction. Thus, in a journal he created called Asclepiad, Benjamin Ward Richardson observes that it's common practice for many people, or many men rather, in busy public life to retire in the course of their day's work to take their dose of morphine, as other men retire to take their nip of spirits or their glass of wine. There's a wonderful image then of all these bankers sitting there with the morphine just under their table, taking little nips each time their clients go in and out. I mean, the claim is really startling, but it does suggest, again, immediate parallels with our popular representations of today's city traders taking the cocaine. Medical and popular reporting of the time suggested that the pressures of modern life created greater propensities for addiction to both drink and drugs, whilst forms of lifestyle created a need for stimulants, whether the professional who lives on excitement in the commercial ring, the political arena, or the game of chance. So here again you have the paralleling of gambling and speculation. Or interestingly, the young girls who took chloral to help them stay awake all night at balls. So interestingly, I had not known until I read this that it was Victorian practice for young ladies to take drugs to make sure they could last the all-nighter. Richardson, who introduced what he called as the new disease of chloralism, noted that it was primarily a middle-class disease amongst commercial, literary, legal, medical, philosophical, artistic and clerical workers. And as I've suggested, I think the parallels with contemporary times are virtually self-evident. One very interesting element of all this is that, as now, if you have all these problems, people with addictions or nervous disorders, they need to go somewhere to recuperate. And climate and health is very much part of this whole new area of concerns with the relationship of mind and body. In the preface to his 1871 work, Montan and the English Riviera as a winter climate, the English physician James Henry Bennett noted that the harassing labours and cares of a London professional life had broken down vital powers and obliged me to seek rest abroad and a genial winter climate. And he was so convinced of Montan's restorative powers that he created a health resort there, making both Montan and the French Riviera hugely popular for exhausted English professionals. And rather wonderfully, when it was thought that people were overstrained in the 19th century, you didn't just go off for 2 weeks, you were told to go off for 6 months recuperation, even a year, which I do wish they'd bring this back. But unfortunately, we seem to be confined to 2 weeks if we're lucky. Obviously, the coming of railways and the ease of travel meant that you had a huge extension of spa culture right across Europe, and particularly indeed in Germany, but also in England, as we desperately tried to emulate these wonderful exotic places in our own shores. The spas, I think, bring together the whole conglomeration of issues being raised. You have the creation of the stress, the belief that the stress in turn brings nervous disorders, and then you have concerns about the environment. Where should you go to get the best healthy climate, and also public health? One interesting area is the ways in which, as soon as the spas were created, they seemed then to engender their own unhealthy environments, and so people forever moving onwards and outwards, trying to find the new and latest spa. And you have then in the theories these interconnected areas of physiological, psychological, and social health. And interestingly, I think it's a sort of integrated vision of the notion of the body within the lived environment, which is something we're only just beginning to recover. I'd like to turn now to Daniel Deronda, which is one of the preeminent novels, I think, of the problems of modernity. It's centrally about rootlessness and exile, and it has three major protagonists. The first, Gwendolen Harleth, a young society lady who's basically spent her early years travelling around the spas of Europe. A young Jewish, a pearl of a young woman, Myra, who we first meet her when she's about to commit suicide, having been traded virtually by her own father and with the attempt to sell her for sex. And then we have another figure, the rather saintly Daniel Deronda, who's been brought up in an English aristocratic environment, but never knowing his parentage, so always worried about what his own roots might be. The novel brings together just about every aspect of these problems of modern life. Gwendolen herself suffers from what Eliot calls fits of spiritual dread, forever being preoccupied by some fears that overtake her, which she cannot control. There are also financial failures of banks, addiction to gambling, because Mara's father is the reason he's trying to prostitute her is that he's lost all his money in gambling. And then, of course, spa culture, because they're all brought together in the opening scene where we find Gwendolen at the gaming tables of a fictional spa town in Germany, Lubron. Now, I want to take a step backwards to understand why George Eliot chose to open her novel in this way. In 1872, she was just finishing her previous novel, Middlemarch. And she writes to her friend Alexander Main, "We start in search of health this afternoon. Our destination to be reached about the end of the next week is Homburg, where we shall not gamble, but drink the waters and cultivate repose of mind. I am at a very low ebb, and during the last week I have run down at a quicker rate into a nervous condition in which the chirping of the grasshopper, if it were to be heard in these parts, would be a noticeable addition to the sounds already irritating me. I am not fit to write much this morning." If you read George Eliot's letters, you will find that probably half of them talk about being in a nervous state, that she's always got a headache and she can't write. And but actually, if you look at what she's doing, she's reading half of Hegel in the morning, then a medical treatise, and then a novel, and then she's doing a review, and then she says by 2:00 in the afternoon, "I don't know why my head hurts." But what she's doing is actually linking the problem she's experiencing to the idea that she's overstressed, that she herself is a creature of nerves. So when they determine to go to Homburg, they're not just being tourists, she's actually going to take the waters. And I want to just show you a few slides about Homburg. Because at this time, you will find the British press is full of adverts for everybody to go to Homburg. I don't know whether you can read it here, but it talks about the Homburg waters being very salutary for all sorts of diseases, especially, it says, nervous affections. And so anybody who thought they were suffering from anything general could go there. Interestingly, I looked up today to see whether it still exists, and you can indeed find adverts for what is now called the Kur Royal at Bad Homburg, the Kaiser Wilhelm Bad, which I don't know whether this is just a mistake or sort of a happy accident in translation, but they described it, what I think is quite hilarious, as not a textile-free spa. I.e., you can't go there in the nude, but I've never come across this expression of textile-free. It's a wonderful euphemism. But anyway, so it's quite respectable. You don't have to go in the nude if you go there now. But in the 19th century, it was very much where those of the middle classes who are wanting to have a genteel holiday might go. You have orchestras, you have ladies' reading rooms, you can have... yes. Sorry, I realise I lean down, I go out of mic, but conversational and reading rooms, cafes, delicious walks and carriage drives. So this is what Eliot was going for. I'll offer you another slide. You can't properly read this, but I think you get the general effect. So this is one of the advertising pages you get in all the magazines. So you have the latest fashions, self-winding watch. Who knew that they had self-winding watches in the 19th century? Advert for baths of Homburg, and then down below, in a wonderful juxtaposition, rat poisoning. So I suppose when you go off to the spa, you can actually lay the rat poisoning, so they'll all be dead when you get back. But it seems a rather nice juxtaposition of the health and the unhealth of the time. And here is an illustration in a British magazine suggesting the allure of Homburg, where you can see, as a fashionable lady, you could actually have a dalliance with a gentleman as you were promenading. So very discreet, but very attractive. Unfortunately, all was not quite that way for George Eliot. She writes, when they've just arrived, to her friend, "We arrived at Homburg on Saturday night and settled in these comfortable lodgings the next morning. The air, the waters, the plantations are all perfect. Only man is vile. I'm not fond of denouncing my fellow sinners, though she is, but gambling being a vice, I have no mind to. It stirs my disgust even more than my pity. The sight of the dull faces bending round the gaming tables, the raking up of the money and the flinging of the coins towards the winners by the hard-faced croupiers, the hateful, hideous women staring at the board like stupid monomaniacs. All this seems to me the most abject presentation of mortals grasping after something called a good that can be seen on the face of this little earth. Burglary is heroic compared with it. I get some satisfaction in looking on from the sense that the thing is going to be put down, because they were going to close it a few years after this. Hell is the only right name for such places. So not really restorative then. 2 weeks later, she writes, the Kursaal is to me a hell, not only for the gambling, but for the light and the heat of the gas, and we've seen enough of its monotonous hideousness. There's very little dramatic stuff to be picked up by watching or listening. The saddest thing to be witnessed is the play of Miss Lee, Baron's grandniece, who is only 26 years old and is completely in the grasp of this mean, money-making demon. It made me cry to see her young, fresh face among the hags and brutally stupid men around her. Now, George Eliot says that there's not much dramatic stuff, but in fact, this is actually the opening of Daniel Deronda. Let's give you... This is a contemporary painting of the Salon d'Or in Homburg, which could well also have played into George Eliot's imaginings of the scene. Interestingly, there's a British painter who, when he travelled to Homburg, discovered that the room was going to be dismantled, and so he actually purchased a lot of it and took it back to Britain in order to paint his picture. So importing Homburg to England. Now, Daniel Deronda opens in what George Eliot describes as in medias res. It goes backwards in the story in order to plunge us directly into this image of Gwendolen at the gaming table of this fictional spa town of Lebrun. This is the very famous opening passage, which I'll read to you. Was she beautiful or not beautiful? And what was the secret of form or expression which gave the dynamic quality to her glance? Was the good or the evil genius dominant in those beams? Probably the evil, else why was the effect that of unrest rather than of undisturbed charm? Why was the wish to look again felt as coercion and not as a longing in which the whole being consents? She who raised these questions in Daniel Deronda's mind was occupied in gambling, not in the open air under a southern sky, tossing coppers on a ruined wall with rags about her limbs, but in one of those splendid resorts which the enlightenment of ages has prepared for the same species of pleasure, at a heavy cost of gilt mouldings, dark-toned colour, and chubby nudities, all correspondingly heavy, forming a suitable condenser for human breath, belonging in great part to the highest fashion, and not easily procurable to be breathed in elsewhere in the like proportion, at least by persons of little fashion. Somewhat heavy-handed, maybe, the opening, but what Eliot is doing here is transforming the decisive hell of her response to Homburg, which now becomes the unsettling demonic quality of Gwendolen's presence as refracted through the observing figure of Daniel Deronda, because it's his thinking, was she beautiful or not beautiful? The very texture of the language is quite interesting in that the term dynamic was very new, seen as very scientific. Her publisher asked her to take it out, but it's to do with the play, the static dynamic forces that they were discussing in physics at the time. And then this condenser, the notion that what was happening in a place that was designed to make you well was that actually all the ills of the period were virtually being condensed down into this poisonous atmosphere, which you had to be very fashionable to inhabit. So there's wonderful contrast between an obviously sort of hugely nostalgic and optimistic vision of what gambling used to be like compared to the horrors of contemporary fashionable society. You have, Eliot suggests, a completely motley collection of figures across class and across countries, all gathered in this gaming place, all reduced, she says, to a certain uniform negativeness of expression which had the effect of a mask, as if they'd all eaten of some root that for the time compelled the brains of each to the same narrow monotony of action. So it's a sense that they're all virtually lotus eaters. And the novel, in a sense, is about the play of energy. It's narrowing down into smaller and smaller circles for people in these gambling arenas or on the stock market, or the opening up and potentiality of new vistas, which we find in the other aspect of the novel, which is when Daniel, who's constantly restless, discovers that he is actually Jewish and embraces his Jewish heritage. Now, gambling in all George Eliot's novels carried a moral taint. It was seen as a violation of what she saw as the laws of moral consequence, by which she meant that if you do something, it carries consequences. No act can go without somehow affecting others and then coming back upon you. And so if you think that you can live your life by chance, you are abandoning any sense of moral responsibility. And here this idea is given even stronger moral freight. Gwendolen, who fancies herself a goddess of luck, is on the eve of discovering that the bank of Grapnell and Co., who, Eliot says, also thought of reigning in the realm of luck, have just failed, and she and her family are about to be made almost penniless. The relationship between gambling and financial speculation is made abundantly clear. The action of the gaming table stands as a microcosm of a society that's lost its way, dominated by a reckless pursuit of wealth, offering neither social nor moral stability. So Daniel Deronda is a condition of England novel, like Dickens' Little Dorrit or Trollope's The Way We Live Now. But George Eliot is not so crude as to focus on the realm of finance itself. Rather, the actions of Grapnell and Co. Form a shadowy backdrop, and we focus rather on the inner psychology of a young girl, product of a life spent moving between fashionable watering places, who believes that she can, like the speculators, win empire and live her life by taking gambles without thought for the moral consequences. Gwendolen has, when we first meet her, that overweening self-confidence, the romance of speculation, which Richardson identified in his Financiers. She has, we are told, repeatedly, a strong sense of her ability to win empire, to control all around her. Yet we also see that she's inwardly fragile, and her empire and self-command built on such tenuous foundations that they can be thrown by the glance of a stranger. Thus the very look of Deronda is enough to throw off her stride and feel that she's mortally in the wrong in this opening scene. Gwendolen, we learn, lost her father when young, and her life was spent roving from one foreign watering place or Parisian apartment to another. She's the very epitome of modern, restless, rootless existence. Eliot intervenes to say, pity that Offendene, which was the home she was living at that point, was not the home of Miss Harleth's childhood, or endeared to her by family memories. A human life, I think, should be well rooted in some spot of a native land, a spot where the definiteness of early memories may be inwrought with affection. And what she's suggesting here is that in order to have an integrated, strong sense of self, you do need to be both physiologically and psychologically rooted. So Gwendolen is a figure of modernity as represented in the cultural and medical texts of the time. A rootless, transient figure filled with delusions of control whilst racked by unaccountable feelings of dread. Now, David Trotter has suggested that one can link Daniel Deronda to the new disease that was identified in 1871 by Westphal of agoraphobia. That's when you're terrified of crossing a square. Or an open space, as Westphal had found, interestingly, that various people had come to him, all very respectable middle-class people, some were soldiers, but they'd been able to brave the difficulties of war, and yet weren't able to cross from one side of a square to another in Berlin. And from this, he developed the diagnosis of agoraphobia. And from that, then you get all sorts of other medical voices coming in and identifying huge ranges of phobias. So by the time you come to 1904, you have Stanley Hall in America identifying, I think, 136 different phobias it was possible to suffer from. And you can see very much that Gwendolen is being identified with this form of phobia. She's afraid of being alone in wide open spaces, afraid of being alone at night. So linked then to this new preoccupation with inexplicable states of fear, which I think does become the defining characteristic of modernity. And with Gwendolen, what happens is that these phobias are linked then to her marriage with a very controlling figure of Grandcourt. And if you're interested in reading a novel about an extraordinary psychological torture within a marriage, I would read Daniel Deronda. You never see him beating her, but you see all the time the way in which she goes from being this self-confident figure to being utterly cowed, unable to move, because everything she does is quietly and firmly controlled and put down by her partner. So she starts to develop fantasies of murdering him. So what happens then is that she has the narrowing and confining of her energies, just as in that opening scene in the gambling salon. And it's as if Eliot has taken Rosamund Vincy, who was the hero, or not the hero, the anti-heroine, I should say, of Middlemarch, a shallow figure who was the flower of Miss Lemon's school, but given her turbid and disturbing inner depths. And George Eliot here then addresses the stereotypes of modernity, but gives them real depth, so the inner psychology of this unschooled girl becomes a microcosm of the problems of the world, social, economic, and political. Now, the novel does offer a form of utopian conclusion, in that Daniel, discovering his Jewish heritage, forsakes Gwendolen, marries Mara, and sets off, quite literally, to found the promised land of Israel. But interestingly, we see very little of this. He simply sets off. So it's a wonderful utopian vision, Eliot really suggesting that she couldn't see any way to bring about the utopia she'd like to see within the British Islands. So it has almost, I think, a dreamlike quality, this ending of the novel. And so for the final section now, I'd like to consider another form of utopia, but this one a lot more practical. This is a proposal for a social utopia in England to cure the diseases of modern life, which was created by Benjamin Ward Richardson. So in 1875, he was about to address the Social Science Congress in Brighton, and he says he had this really boring paper in his pocket on the statistics of death rates. And then he decided instead to throw it all away and to give an imaginative vision of what it would be like to live in a model city, which he calls Hygeia, a city of health. Interestingly, you wouldn't think that one lecture would have that impact, but suddenly he was an international star. The Times paper carried it verbatim, lead articles all over the place, and it was not only in Britain but across Europe and also in America, endless discussions of his proposals, as it really caught the public imagination. Though there were some criticisms, because what he wanted to do was partly was ban drink and tobacco, so not very popular with some people. But what people were attracted by was his belief that it would be possible to transform in large measure the living conditions of large towns and the problems engendered by modernity. Now, his utopia differs from many of its predecessors, in that it's not like, for example, Samuel Butler's Erewhon of 1872, which was a satirical commentary on contemporary society. But nor is it an unrealizable dream. In fact, it was based upon a set of suggestions that had been emerging within the public health movement over the last 20 or so years, many of which Richardson himself had been campaigning for. He addresses his work, he says, not only to his contemporaries, but also those who have yet to be, who are ourselves, unseen to ourselves, continuing our mission. So I think this appeal to ourselves, unseen to ourselves, anticipates current environmental campaigns in which we're exhorted to look beyond our narrow horizons and to think and plan for future generations. Because we don't tend to think of the Victorians as planning for the future and understanding the environmental havoc they were creating, but they did. Now, Richardson's Hygeia, or his City of Health, didn't follow socialist principles, no overturning of social order, so there were still servants. But interestingly, what he did was try and organise the the houses around servants. So instead of having your servants in the basement rooms, because it was that normal that you'd stick them away where you couldn't see them in dark basements, he actually said that servants and kitchens should be put underneath the roof so that they could have light and air. They could pop up onto the rooftop in order to do the washing as well, and they wouldn't have to carry their heavy buckets up and down. So a real sort of sense of not totally egalitarian, but very considerate remodeling. And he also suggested that the Victorians, who were famous for all the clutter they created in their rooms, should strip it all out and have very austere environment, and also get rid of most of their clothes and clutter. And suggested that it should get rid of carpets other than in the central area, so that you could keep an uncarpeted oak border bright and clean with beeswax and turpentine to maintain the sanitizing aspects of the room. Hygeia generated all sorts of products virtually instantly. So here we are, Hygeia, the city of health, patent portable parquet, virtually impossible to say. So one of many health products that came as a result of Hygeia. And you note this obsession with airing and not having fitted carpets. We've come full circle. He also suggested forms of fireplace that had a mode of carbon capture so that there was no smoke. Again, you don't tend to think of the Victorians of being concerned with capturing free carbon, but they did. And perhaps one of the most lasting legacies that he left was his insistence that everywhere had to have gardens. So he said all major public buildings have to be surrounded by gardens. And it was a vision that was taken up by Ebenezer Howard in his famous Garden Cities of Tomorrow of 1902, which in turn exercised a huge influence on city planning of the 20th century. And in later writings, Richardson got even more ambitious and suggested that you should level all the roofs across London, create roof gardens right away across, so all citizens could parade across. And then when he discovered the bicycle, he suggested there should be special cycle tracks also across the roofs of London, which I think we're almost getting there now. Another aspect I just draw your attention to, I think he was the first to talk about passive smoking. So in his campaign against smoking, he suggests that merciless smokers laugh at the faddery of a woman who becomes faint if a smoker charges the air they breathe in a confined space, and also outlines the case of a youth who was temporarily poisoned by inhaling the atmosphere issuing out of a small window of a club room in which a number of men were smoking freely. So a suggestion then that he understood the problems of being within these confined spaces with smoke. I'll just end on Hygeia with just to suggest that also he had what I would call a sanitarian's vision of resurrection, in that he argues against cremation. He was to change his mind later, as disrupting the natural cycle. And he argued that people should be buried in fine carnivorous earth, which would speed decomposition. So anticipating green burials, he says that there should be a basketwork coffin or simply a shroud, so that within a few months there'd be no remains. He says the natural circle of transmutation is harmlessly completed and the economy of nature is preserved. So his vision is an entirely secular one of natural perfection. The sanitarian's belief that sewerage, rightly handled, could, by a modern alchemy, turn waste into a natural wealth, or fertilizer, is here applied to the human body itself. So in place of a Christian resurrection of the spirit, we're given another form of eternal life, setting humanity within a natural scale. As you might imagine, all these ideas created a great deal of fun. I will end by showing you some of the spoofs. So this is fun, almost immediately. Dr. Richardson, out of his fantasies' wealth, has invented a marvellous city of health. Not a single disease can fate give there. Now, if all that he says of his city be true, as a home for its founder, it never would do, for it's certain no doctor could live there. Punch responds. Now, this is a wonderful cartoon. It says, if you can read it, doctors in Hygeia differ from those in London. What you've got here is all the out-of-work doctors in their top hats. The Pavement Artist, I did not know that they had pavement artists in Victorian times, but clearly they did. He's written and done his little drawing. It says, "I am starving." And what's happening is that the crossing sweeper, who normally is the one who's begging, is actually giving money to these starving doctors, because if it's a city of health, what will the doctors do? There's also a vision of food regulations as proposed in Hygieiopolis. And here you have the suggestion that if you are going to have a dinner party, all the menu has to be cleared by the Board of Health. Ladies who intend to wear low-cut dresses, similarly, have to get to the Board of Health. And so it goes on, this complete spoof. It's what we in Britain now call health and safety gone mad. You know, this notion that whatever you do is going to have to be cleared by controlling authorities, and the analytic chemist is going to have control of everything you do. There were also sanitary lyrics. So this is, again, Punch, a sanitary lyric taken from Edgar Poe's Ligeia. Read you just one verse. "Hygeia, thou'rt clever, but twixt you and me, to fidget forever is fiddle-de-dee. We mustn't eat thus and we mustn't drink that, lest sound health we should miss, grow too thin or too fat. Must go in for analysis of all grub about, lest we caught cramp, paralysis, fever or gout. Mustn't travel by rail, must shun riding in cabs. Must, but time would quite fail to tell half thy fads. If a mortal, I think, could such vigilance keep, he ne'er could eat or drink, he would ne'er toil or sleep. Sanitas sanitatum is all very fine, but my ultimatum is this: I must die." Richardson then went on to, a few years later, to produce ideas of what he called healthland or salutland. In this, he'd been talking with a naturalist of the period, Richard Owen, who had argued that if you looked at animal life, it seemed that people were not living long enough, because in the animal kingdom, you live for 5 times the date of your maturity. So he argued that if you apply that to humans, you should live at least 100 years. And in fact, Richardson was very, very keen on long life, and he argued that he set Salutland in 2150 and said that by that time we will all live to 100. And I think in fact, we're going to reach it actually before the period. But yes, so what's happening in the social economics of Salutland? This is fun, and what they're doing is taking the various ideas. So first of all, he says you must get rid of politics and politicians. So this is the politician taking his hemlock. Then the second one is education should be entirely games for the young. So here's the Education Academy. He also suggests that you shouldn't eat animals, and that you should allow them to work with you. So here are the working animals. And then there's the dress reform, how people would be horrified of the Victorian costume. Then the next is someone fainting at the sight of meat, because he says it would be such a strange and odd phenomenon. And then the more socialistic aspect, that incurable criminals to be treated with all imaginable care, even permitted forbidden luxuries. Or another one, crime and insanity are synonymous psychological conditions. So in the Victorian period, we were arguing for the first time that those who commit crimes are actually insane rather than just criminally guilty. And then the end, where he says, aged paupers will end their days in houses with gardens as children of the Commonwealth. So this is the vision of the elderly in their homes behaving like children. And then, as a final slide, this is a vision of utopia, which has got just about every aspect of his argument embedded here in the very crowded picture. But you can see, for example, the pigs that now appear to be pets, the smoke being blown away. There is a coffee tavern rather than the king is being thrown out. So just about every aspect answers to this vision of utopia. And then a final slide. Where is Hygeia, a city of health, to be found? At Bexhill-on-Sea. So this is a very unglamorous resort in Britain. And this is from the 1890s. So you see, Hygeia still has a life. And what the advert is suggesting is that it's within 2 hours of London, the Menton of England, so in their dreams. But it's marketing it to everybody in London. So for your bank holiday, you can rush down to Menton, to Bexhill-on-Sea, rather, where you won't be able to read the small print, but you have German piano recitals, the Kursaal, so everything modelled upon a German spa. So a rather less glorious vision, and it's capitalising on the growth of swift train travel. So then as now, the quest for health was not an escape from, it seems, but a reinforcement of the very commercial pressures which were driving the economy and that the diseases of body and mind it deemed to produce. So to conclude, I've offered a very quick overview of some of the issues and themes I and my team are addressing in the Diseases of Modern Life project. As you'll see, there are many and direct parallels with our current concerns. The aim is not to suggest, however, that the present is simply a reiteration of the past. Clearly, there are very different circumstances and conditions pertaining in contemporary society. What Victorian culture offers, however, in all its energy and its inventiveness, is a new range of perspectives within which to place our current dilemmas. Thank you.